Chapter 6. In the personal column. I had a good deal to do before I could leave for England. From Marseille, I left for Saint-Étienne and Chartres, in both of which towns Jules Cauvin had been known in pre-war days. But little additional information which was of value could I pick up, though I was specially struck by the fact that all who knew him laughed at the bare idea of his having blossomed out into a motor expert. They all seemed equally convinced on this point. One man even ventured the suggestion that, if Cauvin was indeed making huge sums of money from a motor invention, he must have stolen the idea from someone else. "And believe me, monsieur," ejaculated the voluble Frenchman, "he would not be above doing so. Jules Cauvin, an inventor. Phew! He is too lazy. He never did any work if he could help it." However, as I was tolerably sure in my own mind that Cauvin was being handsomely paid for services of quite another kind, this did not help me much. At length, after a journey of a week, during which time I spent only one night in bed, I found myself late one afternoon back in Paris, chatting with my colleagues, Madame Gabrielle Soyer and Henri Aubert, in the former's cosy little flat au troisième in the Boulevard Pereire. To both I gave certain very definite instructions. To the elegant little Frenchwoman I added, "You will proceed to the Grosvenor Hotel in London, and from there will keep the surveillance I have indicated. Remain there until you hear from me. Report progress frequently, at least every other day, in the personal column of the Times." I could scarcely refrain from smiling as I turned from the vivacious Frenchwoman, a Parisian in every detail of her chic appearance, to Henri Aubert, who was to be our colleague in the undertaking we had in hand. Aubert was a sad-faced, rather melancholy-looking middle-aged man, with a face from which every shred of intelligence seemed to have vanished. He looked, indeed, exactly like one of those middle-class nonentities, colourless and featureless, who, by the mysterious workings of the mind of the great god democracy, managed to get themselves elected as municipal councillors, or by superhuman endeavour rise to the position of advocate, and never do any good. But behind his unpromising exterior, which, in fact, was one of his chief assets, since it practically freed him from any possibility of suspicion, was a keen intelligence, trained in every detail of our craft, a patience that knew no wearying on the trail, and a judgment which closed like a steel trap on the essential factor in a complicated situation, and, once having secured a hold, never let go. I knew him well and esteemed him highly, and he possessed the entire trust of the astute Armand Heck, a trust difficult to win, but, once won, fully and freely given. To Aubert I explained the situation as fully as I could, and though I knew him to be a model of circumspection, I ventured on a hint of the extreme care and discretion necessary in the delicate affair if we were to succeed in tracing the source of Cauvin's mysterious rise to sudden wealth. He listened to me with a ghost of a smile on his thin lips, but he was evidently piqued. "Perhaps, Monsieur Sant, someone has been telling you I am a confirmed babbler," he said dryly. And I laughed. The idea of Aubert babbling had its humorous aspect. "I think we understand each other, Monsieur Aubert," I said. "I don't mean to cast any reflections on your discretion, but you know the people we have to deal with." "Quite well, monsieur," replied Aubert, with a real smile this time. "We have a difficult job before us. They have a dangerous gang over in England just now. Pierre Gartin was murdered there only last week, shot in a street row, unquestionably got up for the occasion. Of course, the assassin escaped in the crowd. I think we had better take our revolvers." He spoke as coolly as though his revolver were his umbrella. I was startled. Pierre Gartin was one of the most capable men we had, and I knew he had been engaged on a piece of work very similar to that which we had in hand. In my absence, I had not heard of his death. "No, I had not heard," I replied. "But I agree with you that our revolvers might be useful. Aubert's news told me that our Hun antagonists must have some very big plan in hand. Even the most desperate of spies draws the line at murder, unless he finds himself in an impasse with no other way out. This is not, of course, from any special reluctance to taking the life of an enemy, but simply as a matter of self-preservation. For we are so peculiarly constituted that we tolerate calmly the work of pestiferous agents whose activities are a greater peril to the community than a dozen murders would be, while the killing of a single man brings a hornet's nest about the murderer's ears. I knew, therefore, that since the Huns had gone so far as to remove Garten, they must be engaged in work of supreme importance, and must have been quite aware that he was hot on their trail. Truly, we had an interesting prospect before us, but we were all tolerably well used to danger, and I do not think it affected any of us. "Only last night," said Aubert, "Cauvin entertained Bonnier, of the Admiralty, and no doubt he learned something from him. I have found out that he has been lending Bonnier a good deal of money. Bonnier has recently got mixed up with a farce set, and he has been spending a great deal more money than his income warrants. When people of that kind begin to consort with rogues of Corvin's stamp, it usually means only one thing." "No doubt that is true enough," I replied, "but for the present we must take even the risk of leaving Bonnier alone. I want absolute evidence that Covan's money comes from Germany, even though he actually gets it from a secret source in England. It is not enough for me to prove either that Bonnier is selling secrets or that Covan is buying them. I want to prove that Covan's money is German, and I am going to do it. Bonnier can wait. If we get Covan, we are tolerably sure to obtain sufficient evidence to lay Bonnier by the heels at any time. In fact, we can remove him quietly as soon as Covan is out of the way. I shall leave for England tomorrow." This I did, and 24 hours later I was in London. I decided first to investigate Covan's supposed motor invention and made my way to the office of a well-known patent agent in Chancery Lane. He had done some business before for me and greeted me warmly. I knew him so thoroughly that I did not hesitate to tell him exactly what I was after. "But, my dear Sant," he said, "if this supposed invention is being kept as a secret to stagger the motoring world, it is not likely to have been patented yet by either Cauvin or anyone else. Depend upon it, if there is anything in it, it is being manufactured secretly, and will not be patented until it is absolutely ready for the market. To patent it now would simply be setting every motor expert in the country at work on similar lines. You know, the patent lists are watched with the keenest scrutiny. My clerk is looking into the matter, and we shall soon know whether Cauvin has patented anything." This was a surprise for me. I could not, of course, however much I might suspect him, absolutely rule out of my calculations the possibility that even Cauvin might have hit upon some lucky idea, as so many inventors have done, without knowing much of the technicalities of the subject. I did not forget that the safety pin was the invention of a lazy workman, and I knew that if I took any active steps against Cauvin and made a mistake, if, by some miraculous chance, his sudden wealth was honestly acquired, the consequences would be serious. "Well," I said, when we had been assured that no patent of any kind had been taken out by Cauvin, "what am I to do? I can't go to every big motor engineer in England and ask him if he is manufacturing a secret device invented by Jules Cauvin." My friend thought for a few moments. "I think you had better see L," he said at last. "If there is anything big in hand, some kind of whisper of it is sure to have got about, and he would be the first to hear. I will telephone him at once. We shall catch him in his office on the viaduct." A few minutes later, we were in Holborn in L's office. He was one of the magnates of the motoring world. I explained the position. "You can make your mind easy on that point," he said emphatically. "There is nothing going in the trade today big enough to produce the amount of money your man is evidently receiving. If there were, I must have heard of it. It could not be kept secret. You remember the Marx carburettor? Well, we knew for 6 months that it was coming, though every effort was made to keep it secret. What we did not know was the exact secret, but you know how it took the market by storm. This, even though it were only negative evidence, seemed to establish conclusively the fact that Corvin's money, whatever might be its source, was not derived from the motor trade. I made up my mind that this much at least was certain. Next day I travelled down to Old World Chester, where I very speedily discovered that there was in Whitefriars no house numbered 118, and no trace of any person named Wheatley, while the aged vicar of St. Mary's knew nothing of the marriage of Captain James Easterbrook. Everything was fictitious. Everything, that is, except the silver-printed wedding card and the clinging perfume of stag-leaved geranium. What did the bogus card indicate? Why had Jules Cauvin's unknown correspondent gone to the trouble of having it printed? And why, in defiance of all social custom, had it been scented with such a perfume as that of the stag-leaved geranium? I felt tolerably sure that here lay the key of the mystery, and that when I laid my hand on the sender of that mysterious card, I should be very near indeed to the knowledge of the real source of the strange sequence of events which had raised the good-for-nothing son of an obscure French postman to a dazzling position in the world of society. Such was the problem I had to solve, and the key to it was just one bogus wedding card impregnated with the slowly dying odor of geranium. I cursed my luck as I reflected on the magnitude of the issues at stake and the paucity of the tools with which I had to work. For if Captain James Easterbrook was unknown in Chester, the home of his supposed bride, what was my chance of penetrating his disguise? Yet, somehow or other, we must succeed. That Corvin was receiving money from England, I was absolutely convinced, and I was determined to take this chance, the best we had had, of locating the real men behind the hidden hand in England. Next day I left Chester by a very early train for London. When we reached Rugby, I bought a copy of the Times, and the first thing that caught my eye was a cryptically worded message at the head of the personal column. It conveyed to me the startling news that Madame Gabrielle had been recognized by some alien agent of whom she was highly suspicious, had left the Grosvenor Hotel in her alarm, and had returned to Paris. Chapter 7. The elusive Van Rosen. Evidently, something very serious had happened. My first impulse was to hasten to the Grosvenor Hotel, engage a room there, and try to discover something of the cause which had brought about Madame Gabrielle's sudden flight. Perhaps my anxiety for her safety operated more powerfully than I ought to have allowed. In our business, personalities are nothing. It is the end that counts. A moment's reflection showed me that in taking this course I should simply be playing into the enemy's hands. I was too well known. I hoped that my presence in England was not suspected by the German agents, and if I ventured to stay at the Grosvenor, they would certainly very soon have me under close observation. By using the official telephone between London and Paris, I managed to get into communication with Madame Gabrielle at her flat in the Boulevard Pereire, and soon learnt the reason for her flight. Van Rosen had discovered her and was watching her closely. Here, indeed, was an antagonist worthy of my steel. I had long known, and so far as his abilities went, had respected Van Rosen as one of the cleverest agents of the Königgrätzerstrasse. He was able to pose as an Englishman, a rare accomplishment in a German, for he had been educated at Haileybury and had been in England off and on since his youth. He was now living in a northwestern suburb, where he posed as Mr. George Hugan Rose, a solicitor who had retired from practice. Only British apathy made this possible. A moment's investigation would have shown that the man could not have been what he pretended, for no such retired solicitor as Mr. George Hugan Rose was known to the Law Society. As a matter of fact, it was through this very slip on his part that I had spotted Van Rosen. We had suddenly lost sight of him a year or two before, and try as we would, for we knew that wherever he might be, he would be dangerous. We could not locate him. The accident which led to his discovery was curious. I had been spending a few days in North London, and one morning stopped at the railway bookstall to buy a paper. As I approached the stall, a tall, gentlemanly-looking man, who had been chatting with the clerk, turned away and entered the train. Something about him struck me as strangely familiar. "Who is that gentleman?" I asked the man at the stall. "Oh," he replied, "that's Mr. Hugan Rose. He used to be a solicitor in the city, but he retired and has been living here for a year or two." But I was not quite satisfied. Some odd memory, in which I felt sure Mr. Hugan Rose was concerned, haunted me all the way to town, and I could not shake it off. I had only seen Van Rosen once, though I had had a good deal of experience, and it was not surprising that I failed to recognize him. When I got up to town, I consulted the law list, but could find no trace of Mr. Hugan Rose. Then I became more suspicious, and before many days were over, I had succeeded in definitely identifying Mr. Hugan Rose with one of the Kaiser's cleverest spies. Thus, the mystery of Van Rosen's disappearance was solved by his own slip. If, when I looked up the law list, I had found Mr. Hugan Rose's name and address duly set out, I should probably have thought I had been deceived by some chance resemblance and wasted no more time on the matter. How true it is that trifles make the sum of life. The position now was plainly serious. Van Rosen's presence in London boded no good. The man was as unscrupulous as he was clever. The British contra-espionage department knew him well and had been greatly chagrined at losing sight of him. Afterwards, in consequence of my report to Heck, he had been kept under close observation, but we had never been able to secure sufficient proof to justify his arrest, strong though our suspicions were. He had evidently been walking very warily since the outbreak of war. Unfortunately, he had adopted that easiest of all cloaks of the German spy, and had become a naturalized Englishman just before war broke out. But the adage, once a German, always a German, applied with special force to Van Rosen. After speaking with Madame Gabrielle, I had a long chat with Heck over the private wire, and together we mapped out a pretty comprehensive plan of campaign, in which both Aubert and Madame Gabrielle had very definite parts to play. Then the mysterious scented wedding card claimed my full attention, for I was determined to sift its secret to the bottom. First, I paid a visit to Somerset House, where I very thoroughly searched the records of recent marriages. These showed me that no marriage had taken place between persons named Wheatley and Easterbrook. A certain Agnes Wheatley had been born in June 1894 at Mina Road, Old Kent Road, in the parish of St. George the Martyr, Southwark, and there were records of two James Easterbrooks. One was James Stanley Easterbrook, born in Lord Street, Southport, in 1881. The other, James Henry Charlton Easterbrook, had first seen the light of day in the village of Fortevy Perthshire in 1870. The army list, of course, failed to show any Captain James Easterbrook of the Royal Fusiliers. All this did not carry me much farther. The father of the Southport Easterbrook was apparently a prosperous Blackburn tradesman, but that of the man born in Scotland was vaguely set down as of no occupation, a curious entry for a Scottish village, where practically everybody would be likely to live by the labour of his hands, and where one would hardly expect to find persons of leisured independence. The fact worried me, but an inquiry at Forteviot showed that there had been no Easterbrooks in the village for many years, and no one seemed to recollect anything about them. In order to conceal myself from the astute Van Rosen, I had taken rooms in a cheap boarding house full of old ladies in Guildford Street, Bloomsbury, and equipped with a silver discharge badge and a set of faked army papers, posed as an invalided soldier recovering his health before taking up work. I was thus able to disarm the inquisitive prying of my fellow boarders, and I am afraid I gave them some highly remarkable information about the war and my share in it. If one is engaged in spying or contra-espionage work, one must be ever ready to combat silly suspicions that give rise to endless gossip and to evade unfriendly and malicious comment. The enigma of the wedding card worried me incessantly. That the prosperous Jules Cauvin was one of the puppets of Potsdam, and also that he had betrayed France, I felt morally convinced. Heck, indeed, held documentary evidence of Cauvin's friendship with the Austrian millionaire spy, Herr Jellink. I knew, almost with certainty, that the perfumed wedding card was intended to convey a message of some kind, since in every particular it was clearly shown to be a bogus document. Yet without more direct evidence, Cauvin, had we ventured to arrest him, must have slipped out of the clutches of the law. For after all, mere friendship or acquaintance with a spy, however suspicious, does not prove the guilt of espionage. Inquiries made by the British Special Branch soon showed that none of the Easterbrooks in the British Army could by any possibility be connected with the Captain Easterbrook of the wedding card. Within a week I established the fact that Agnes Wheatley had died before she reached the age of 10 years. Therefore, she could not have been the mysterious bride to whose wedding Jules Cauvin and his wife had been invited. I was thus thrown back on the two Easterbrooks, and for the next few days, if I may use the term, I breakfasted, lunched, and dined on Easterbrooks. And helping in my quest were some of the smartest men of the British Special Branch. 6 weeks went by, weeks of feverish activity and incessant patient investigation. That mysterious wedding card, with its pungent odor of stag-leaved geranium, hypnotized me, and I could think of nothing else. And everything began to seem so hopeless that even the Scotland Yard men, most unrelenting and unwearying searchers out of hidden mysteries, began to get depressed and to fancy they were hopelessly beaten. Van Rosen, of course, was under constant surveillance. Whether he suspected it or not, I do not know, but for the time being he seemed to have entirely abandoned his usual business. He went about quite openly, and I often wondered whether he was tacitly defying us. Probably his work was so far advanced that he could afford to wait and hope to disarm suspicion by the very openness of everything he did. Had there been any real necessity, we could, of course, have arrested him on some charge or another, but we still hoped that by giving him plenty of latitude, we should sooner or later stumble on some valuable information. Chapter 8. One of the Naturalized. The weeks slipped by. We seemed no nearer gaining our object, and I found myself wondering at times whether indeed I was not engaged on a wild goose chase. Poring over everything that was known of Jules Cauvin, I sometimes found myself ridiculing my own suspicions. Still, that mysterious card forced itself on my attention. Corvin's friendship with Jelink, his known association with Mir Soyadef, shot as a spy in Russia, his sudden and inexplicable wealth, all convinced me in the long run that there was a deep secret to be fathomed. I had the chain of evidence nearly complete, but one link was missing: the source of Corvin's wealth and the identity of the mysterious individual from whom he drew unstinted funds. 3 weeks more passed. The special branch at Scotland Yard was becoming disheartened. I myself was losing hope, and Heck was obviously growing restive. Then the tide turned. One of the special branch, apparently by the merest accident, discovered the printer of the bogus card. This was a discovery indeed. I hastened to interview the printer, the proprietor of a small jobbing business named James in the Uxbridge Road. The cards, he told me, were ordered by Mr. Easterbrook for the wedding of his son, the Captain Easterbrook referred to. Mr. Easterbrook lives in Lancaster Gate, and, referring to his order book, he gave me the address, for which I thanked him. "Did you perfume the cards before you printed them?" I asked him carelessly. I had kept the most important question till the last. "Perfume them," he snorted, glaring at me through his spectacles. "Why, of course not. We don't send invitation cards to weddings." I knew that well, but I was glad to get the fact verified. And now for Mr. Easterbrook and the captain. I was in high spirits, for I felt that at length I was getting near the heart of the mystery. Going direct to Lancaster Gate, I soon found the Easterbrooks' house, a large, handsome building overlooking Hyde Park. A few local inquiries soon told me all I wanted to know, and shortly after I was conveying my news to Heck over the Paris telephone. For once, the phlegmatic little man was shaken out of his habitual reserve, and his voice, when he had heard my news, fairly trembled with excitement. At last we were at close grips with our mysterious foe. Next day, Madame Gabrielle, whom I sent for again, and Aubert were installed in rooms in an obscure house in Bayswater. I spent the evening with them, and together we evolved a plan of operations which, I confess, required considerable bounce. I do not like the expression daring when it has to be applied to one's self. By this time I had cut myself adrift from our excellent colleagues of the special branch, fearing lest Van Rosen and his friends might get on my track. So far, apparently, he had not located me, for though I kept the sharpest possible lookout, assisted by a clever detective who habitually assumed different disguises for the purpose, I could find no evidence whatever that I was being shadowed. Madame Gabrielle, Aubert, and myself were also working apart, though I was directing the general plan of operations. Following up the trail I had struck in the Uxbridge Road, I soon secured some astounding facts regarding Mr. Essendine Easterbrook of Lancaster Gate. He was actually a native of Frankfurt, who, after a brief but amazingly successful career in the city as a promoter of rubber companies, had amassed a big fortune and retired from the game of finance. He had become naturalized in 1909 and, profiting by the Britain's amazing indulgence to aliens of every kind, had changed his name from Essendine Wilhelm Eastbrook to Essendine William Easterbrook. Very few people, I found out, had any idea of his real origin and of his German parentage and nationality. Now Mr. Easterbrook had no son. He had, however, an English wife, and his wealth had won for them a position in London society. They had frequently, before the war, entertained at their handsome house the wily director of propaganda, von Kuhlmann, who was then living in London, and also a certain Max Garlick. But try as I would, I completely failed to establish any sort of connection between the Easterbrooks and Mr. Hugan Rose. The name of Garlick, however, told me a lot. Garlick had been the German secret police councillor in France for the departments of the Nord, the Pas-de-Calais, the Somme, and the Ardennes. He was an ex-naval lieutenant, and 2 years before the war broke out was appointed to the arduous but lucrative office of Polizirath for London, establishing his office nearly opposite the Army and Navy stores in Victoria Street, Westminster. This Mouchard, in order to disguise his true occupation, was in the habit of putting in a few hours' work daily at a desk in the London offices of the Hamburg America line in Cockspur Street. That Essendine Easterbrook, the father of the non-existent captain, had been the friend of Max Garlick was quite sufficient to show his connection with the enemy, for Garlick had been the head of the actives in England. We then set to work to obtain more inside evidence. Aubert, on my instructions, watched carefully, and soon made an opportunity of getting into the confidence of Mrs. Easterbrook's English maid, a young woman named Dean. He found out without much trouble that she was not greatly attached to her mistress, who, in spite of her gushing manners in society, was harsh and domineering towards those in her employ, and was totally incapable of winning either respect or affection. Dean had been engaged from a local registry office in the neighbourhood, a fact which materially facilitated our plans. I had a long interview with the young woman. She had a sweetheart serving in the army, who had seen a good deal of German methods and had told the girl enough of the sufferings of the conquered French and Belgian populations to fill her with an intense hatred of Germans and everything German. Directly I informed her that she had been working for a naturalized German, her indignation knew no bounds, and she willingly gave me a lot of valuable information. She declared, moreover, that she would not remain in the place another day. This, too, was exactly what was wanted. I impressed upon her the necessity of keeping absolutely silent on the subject of her employer's real character, and set about the task of getting her place filled with a nominee of my own. This, of course, could be no other than the resourceful Madame Gabrielle, who, laying aside, as she often did, her wedding ring, registered her name at the registry office as a French maid. A handsome douceur to the excellent registry keeper and some highly satisfactory references, carefully prepared for the occasion, accomplished what we wanted, and in the course of a week I had the satisfaction of knowing that the Easterbrook household was under the close surveillance of one of my smartest assistants, who posed as Mademoiselle d'Arbour, and was quite certain to miss no opportunity that might present itself to her. We soon obtained further information about Mr. Easterbrook. He was evidently a wealthy man in reality, as well as appearance, owning, in addition to the Lancaster Gate house, a big estate in Derbyshire, a shooting box in the Highlands, and a villa at Cabé Roquebrune, above Cap Martin, not far from Cauvin's Villa des Fleurs at Mentone. Moreover, he dabbled in yachting after a fashion, more, I suspected, for purposes of social advertisement than from any love of a sport which makes but a slight appeal to Germans. We were, of course, living on the edge of a powder magazine, and the position of Madame Gabrielle, alone in the very camp of the enemy, was especially perilous. At any moment, one or all of us might be recognized by the alert agents of Van Rosen, and I was beginning to know enough of the true position of Mr. Easterbrook to realize that the desperate men with whom we had to deal would stick at nothing to rid themselves of danger if once they divined our identity and purpose. For Madame Gabrielle, I was especially anxious, and more than once I debated seriously whether I was justified in allowing a woman to run so grave a risk. For Aubert and myself, of course, such a question naturally did not arise. Risk was a part of our profession, and we accepted it just as we accepted a wet day. However, we were playing for a great stake, and I finally decided to play the game out to a finish. A month passed. The reports I received from Madame Gabrielle, working inside the house, and from the painstaking Aubert, who let nothing outside escape him, were full of interest. Mr. Easterbrook, formerly Herr Essendine Eastbrook, native of Frankfort, remained entirely unsuspicious that he was under the eye of one of the keenest secret agents in Europe. It was important that he should remain in ignorance, and I prepared a little plan which I felt sure would be so completely reassuring to him that it would throw him completely off his guard, and yet put him in such a position that he would find it almost impossible to resist the temptation, carefully arranged by us, to betray the country of his adoption. It so happened that an important post had become vacant in a certain government department dealing with a large number of confidential plans. I found out from Madame Gabrielle that, as a matter of fact, Easterbrook had for a long time been working strenuously to secure a government appointment. Honorary, of course, since money was no object to him except as a means to an end. I have no doubt whatever that his motives were twofold. The first was, by securing official recognition, to remove any suspicion that might cling to him in consequence of his enemy origin. The second, I have just as little doubt, was to secure better opportunities of playing the spy. I made up my mind to oblige him in both particulars, but to arrange the denouement myself. I went to the minister concerned and revealed my plan. When I had fully explained to him what we knew and how much we suspected, he realized the gravity of the situation, and, though my request was entirely irregular, he consented to what I asked. A week later, a paragraph in the London papers announced that Mr. Essendine Easterbrook had been appointed a controller in a certain department of the Admiralty. There were a few cavillings in some quarters on account of Easterbrook's origin, but to the general public the position did not seem to be one of great importance, and little notice was taken of the appointment. As a matter of fact, the position was a bogus one, created for the occasion, and everything connected with it had been arranged by the astute special branch with the sole design of entrapping Mr. Essendine Easterbrook and the intermediary, whoever it might be, between the German agents in England and Jules Corvan. For the wedding card had proved beyond doubt that Easterbrook and Corvan were in close communication. Chapter 9. The Secret of the Perfume. Mr. Easterbrook soon found himself comfortably ensconced in a large room and surrounded by a staff, every single member of which, though he little suspected it, was in the direct employ of the special branch. Few suspects have ever been subjected to such microscopic scrutiny. He literally could not make a single movement unobserved. He was constantly shadowed in and out of his office by agents who were relieved every few hours. Inside his house, Madame Gabrielle was incessantly on the watch, and in the meantime we prepared for him the trap which proved his undoing. One day Mr. Easterbrook found awaiting his attention a number of copies of an urgent and strictly confidential memorandum which gave in elaborate detail the plan of a naval operation which for sheer daredevilry was enough to take one's breath away. Needless to say, it was spoof from beginning to end, but it was spoof so thoroughly plausible in its conception and so artistically worked out in its wealth of detail that it might well have deceived someone far better versed than Herr Eastbrook in naval matters. I had the privilege of going over it with the distinguished naval officers who drew it up, and I can hear today the roars of laughter with which it was received by the company of experts gathered to listen to the elaborate joke. Of course, the men who really knew detected the imposture at once. To the novice, the plan looked like the details of a gigantic attack on one of Germany's strongest naval bases. Now we calculated deliberately that Easterbrook, getting hold of the bogus plan, would be unable to resist the temptation to communicate it to Germany. To him, we knew, it must appear of stupendous importance. It was too elaborate for him to attempt to memorize the details, and far too long to give him a chance of copying it unobserved. Moreover, we decided to convince him, if possible, that he could purloin a copy without risk. Now, with confidential documents of importance, every single copy must be accounted for. The printing is done under the closest supervision. The exact number of sheets of paper required is issued. Every official who receives a copy signs for it and gets a receipt when he parts with it. Mr. Easterbrook had been well drilled in the routine. We had made him especially careful by inducing him on one occasion carelessly to sign for 4 copies of a document when he only received 3, and the trouble we raised about the missing copy must have made him determined to count his copies in future. We relied on that to catch him and his associates. Early one morning a messenger laid upon Mr. Easterbrook's desk 4 copies of the naval plans. Please sign for 3 copies of number 27,162 AB, Mr. Easterbrook, said the lad, laying the book before him. A keen-eyed watcher saw Mr. Easterbrook glance at the heading of the document which lay before him. Clever though he was unable to repress a start of astonishment as the amazing title, carefully designed for the occasion, caught his eye. A moment later he had recovered himself, counted his copies of the paper, and glancing at the book, signed for 3. The bait was swallowed. I must now hark back to Madame Gabrielle to make clear the chain of events which followed. The sprightly Frenchwoman soon found out that beneath an unprepossessing exterior, her employer concealed an extremely amorous disposition. Exerting the full power of her fascinating personality, she soon began to exercise a considerable influence over the financier, and was able at length to solve the problem of the mysterious perfume. A few hours after the secret plans had been laid before him, Easterbrook made a clandestine arrangement to dine with Madame Gabrielle at a restaurant in Soho the next evening. "I have to go out of town tonight," he said. "I don't want to write, but if you get by tomorrow's post a plain sheet of paper scented with geranium, I shall be there. If it is scented with violet, you will know I have been detained and cannot come." So the secret was out at last. The wedding card had been a signal to Queux that all was well. Had it been scented with violet, it would have indicated danger. As will be seen, we had little difficulty in guessing the purpose of Easterbrook's absence from his house that night. We calculated that, finding he had been debited with 3 copies of the plans, whereas he actually received 4, Easterbrook would calmly pocket one of them and return to the proper department the 3 for which he had signed. Events proved that we were right. In the afternoon, at the usual time, he left the office. 3 minutes later, we ascertained that the 4th copy of the plans was not in his desk. He had taken it with him, and it was easy to guess his purpose. From that moment, his doom was sealed. We could have arrested him at once, of course, but we wanted to know by what means those plans were to be dispatched to Germany. If we could only find that out, one finger of the hidden hand would assuredly be lopped off for good. On leaving the office, Easterbrook made for a public telephone office, where, as it happened, 3 boxes stood side by side. As he entered the one, an agent of the special branch entered the one farthest from him. The boxes were of the 3pence in the slot pattern, and the trifling delay caused by dropping in the 3 pennies gave the detective his opportunity. Ringing up the operator at the exchange, he demanded, in the name of the police, that Easterbrook's conversation should be tapped. The operator promptly plugged him onto the line Easterbrook was using, so that he was able to listen, quite unknown to Easterbrook, to the conversation which followed. "Is that 7257 North?" Easterbrook began. "I want to speak to Mr. Hugan Rose," he went on. "That you, Rose? This is Easterbrook. Will you come down to Piccadilly and have some dinner with me? I am just arranging a yachting trip, and perhaps you would like to make one of the party. All right. Be at Scott's at 7 o'clock. Goodbye." And he rang off. 7 o'clock found Easterbrook and Hugan Rose dining comfortably at Scott's. 4 men of the special branch, immaculately attired and apparently mere men about town, were seated at different tables near them. Easterbrook and his guest talked yachting ostentatiously, and many maps and papers were handed backward and forward. One of these, the lynx-eyed watchers noted, passed from Easterbrook to Hugan Rose and was not returned. It was the confidential paper. Another link in our chain had been forged. At 10:30, the 2 conspirators rose to leave. At the door of the restaurant, they brushed past a man in seafaring dress, quite obviously a Dutch sailor, and, swiftly though it was done, one of our watchers saw a folded paper slip from Hugan Rose's hand into that of the Dutchman. He made off at once, closely shadowed by 2 of our men, while Easterbrook and Hugan Rose walked away together, evidently looking for a taxicab, none too numerous at that hour. Just as a cab drew up to the curb, I arrived on the scene. I had been kept closely informed of what was going on, and had been waiting in a neighbouring restaurant in order to be present at the arrest of the 2 plotters. Incautiously I approached too near, and in the light of a street lamp van, Rosen caught sight of me. He recognized me instantly. With a snarl of rage he turned on me, and his hand shot to his hip pocket. Then he recovered his self-possession and entered the taxi with Easterbrook. No doubt he reflected that a shot at me would not help him, and, it should be noted, neither man had any incriminating document on him. The plans were in possession of the Dutch sailor, and until they were secured, we had to hold our hands. But one quarry was safe now. The taxi soon deposited the 2 men at Easterbrook's house, which was immediately closely surrounded. Half an hour later, Madame Gabrielle, hatless and showing every sign of a struggle, slipped from a side door. Breathlessly, she explained that Van Rosen, catching sight of her as he was going to his room on the 1st floor, had recognized her at once and had attacked her furiously. Why he did not shoot her, I never could understand. Physically, Madame Gabrielle was a match for him. She was a superb gymnast and in hard training, whereas Van Rosen had been leading a dissipated life and was in thoroughly poor condition. A brief struggle had ended in Madame Gabrielle throwing him heavily by a simple wrestling trick, and knowing that she must get away at all cost, she had rushed down the back stairway and got into the street. A moment or 2 later, a servant left the house and posted some letters in the pillar box a few yards away. The letters were recovered later, and one of them, a postcard, was found to be addressed to Jules Cauvin. It was in a feminine handwriting, and bore neither the date nor the address of the writer. It read, "My dear Jules, Henri will return home tomorrow. He has immensely enjoyed his visit, and his health has greatly improved. Yours, Marie." Innocent enough, but the card was perfumed with violets. Clearly enough its purpose was to let Cauvin know that danger was in the air. We were expecting every moment the news that the Dutch sailor had been arrested with the incriminating documents in his possession. That would have been the signal for the arrest of Easterbrook and Van Rosen. But the arrest was not to be made. Far away to the east, we heard the low boom of a gun. Another and another followed. Then came the crash of high explosives, and we realized that an air raid was in progress. Nearer and nearer came the sounds of guns and bombs. Suddenly I picked up the drone of an aerial motor directly overhead, and a few seconds later came an appalling crash that seemed to shake the very earth. I saw a red blaze flash out over Easterbrook's house, and after that everything was a blank. I came to my senses to find myself in Charing Cross Hospital, and when I feebly opened my eyes, the first object to catch my sight was Armand Heck, seated at my bedside, placidly reading a book. Hearing my gasp of astonishment, he turned to me. "Ah, mon cher Gerald, so you are awake at last," he said cheerily. "How are you feeling?" "Very shaky," I whispered. "What has happened?" "Ah, yes, I remember now," I said, as a flood of recollections swept over me. "Is it all right? Have you got Van Rosen and Easterbrook?" "Everything is quite satisfactory, my dear Gerald," replied Heck. "I will tell you all about it when you are stronger." But weak though I was, I could not bear the suspense. "Tell me at once. Monsieur Heck, I beg of you, or I shall never rest." And Heck, choosing the lesser of 2 evils, decided to unburden himself. Van Rosen and Easterbrook are both dead, he said. The bomb which rendered you unconscious struck Easterbrook's house and killed them both. Mrs. Easterbrook is terribly injured, but is alive and will probably recover. Madame Gabrielle is quite safe, and Aubert, who was watching near you, was sheltered from the explosion by a projecting wall and was only badly shaken. He telephoned me at once, and I fortunately caught a train which was just leaving, and here I am. You have been unconscious for a day and a half. What about the Dutch sailor? I managed to gasp out in my astonishment. Oh, replied Heck. We got him all right, with the plan in his possession. He has made a clean breast of everything. The plans were to have been photographed down to microscopic size, and the films taken over to Corvin, sewn into his clothing. 2 of my men are on their way to arrest Corvin at once. But Cauvin proved too quick for us. As the agents of the Sûreté approached his house, he must have recognized them and realized that the game was up. Directly they intimated to him that he was under arrest, he snatched a revolver from his pocket and shot himself before their eyes. I have no doubt the result would have been the same if he had received the violet-scented card, which now, with the bogus invitation to the Easterbrook wedding, remains one of my cherished mementos of one of the most fascinating of the many mysteries I have helped to unravel. Thus, by the hands of the Huns themselves, the public was spared an astounding scandal, and the Allies were rid of 3 ingenious scoundrels engaged in a clever and insidious campaign. After Easterbrook's death, we were able to unravel the whole conspiracy. Easterbrook and Van Rosen were 2 of the fingers of the hidden hand in England. They operated by means of banking accounts in various names, handling large sums placed freely at their disposal by other wealthy naturalized Britons, who proved in their own persons the truth of the adage coined in 1914 by a naturalized Hun. Once a German, always a German. Most of them were laid by the heels, and now, behind barricades of barbed wire in remote parts of the country, have leisure to repent the day when they matched their cunning against the skill of the International Secret Service Bureau of the Allies. Chapter 10. The Mystery of Blind Heinrich. Blind Heinrich. Without any conscious effort of memory on my part, these words flashed suddenly into my mind as, 6 weeks or so after the events just related, I sat lazily in Armand Heck's private room in the Boulevard des Capucines, turning over our latest problem in my mind while I waited for the astute chief, who was busy investigating a report which had just been brought in by one of his numerous financial clients. In other words, by one of the numerous expert agents whom he kept constantly busy up and down Europe, at the task of countering the villainous work of the spy bureau in Berlin. I wonder whether he is mixed up in the affair, I mused, rapidly working out a new train of thought to which the old scoundrel's name had given rise. So intent was I that I did not notice Heck's entrance. His quick eye noticed my absorption. "A penny for your thoughts, mon cher Gerald," he laughed. "Well," I said with a smile, "I was pretty far away, I admit. The fact is, I was wondering whether blind Heinrich is taking any part in the game." The director of the International Secret Service of the Allies raised his brows and stared at me across the big, littered writing table. Behind him, a tape machine was clicking out its message, just as it should in a well-ordered financier's office. He was evidently surprised. "By Jove!" he exclaimed in English, which he spoke to perfection. "I never thought of him. My dear Gerald, old Heinrich is an extremely wily bird, and if he is mixed up in this business, we shall have all our work cut out. Remember how he wriggled out of our hands in the Gould Affair when we thought we had him safely netted?" The Gould Affair! I should think I did remember it. I took a part in tracing and arresting the spy, Frederick Adolphus Gould, who lived near Chatham, and who, a few months before the war, was sent to prison for 5 years for attempted espionage. The case was a bad one. For years, Gould had posed, like so many of his unscrupulous countrymen, as a good, patriotic John Bull Englishman, unable to speak German, expressing hatred of Germany and the Kaiser, and warning us that wax would come. Yet, After his arrest, I had gone to Germany very much incognito to make inquiries, and found that exceedingly patriotic Englishman was the son of a certain Baron von S., that he had been born in Berlin in 1851, had fought in the Franco-German War, and had been awarded the customary Iron Cross. Now, one of Gould's closest friends in England had been a certain Norwegian named Heinrich Christensen, a half-blind violinist who lived at Hampstead. Some strange facts came to light in the course of our inquiries, but the afflicted musician forestalled us by very cleverly coming forward and denouncing his whilom friend. Not, however, before he saw that Gould was quite hopelessly entangled in the net which had been spread for him by the British Secret Service. His action, of course, was quite in accord with German practice. Seeing that the game was up, so far as Gould was concerned, he saved himself on the principle that one loss was better than two. His name had leapt spontaneously into my mind in connection with the latest problem upon which we were engaged, the mysterious manner in which, despite the rigid British censorship, details of the damage done in London by the raiding Gothas were so quickly and so accurately transmitted to Berlin. That they were so transmitted we knew, for the German papers promptly published them. And obviously, if severely censored matters of this kind were leaking out, there was some channel of information open of which we were unaware. We had to find and close it. Now, as is well known, every wireless message which passes from the outer world to Berlin or from Berlin to the outer world is picked up and decoded at our wireless stations. The news was, we knew, not sent by wireless, yet it was clear the Wilhelmstrasse got early information, not only as to where the bombs were dropped, but the extent of the damage done, both points on which they could not obtain the slightest information from the English papers. These details were published by the German and Swiss papers, and allowing for Berlin's invariable exaggeration of its own prowess, they were remarkably full and accurate. The task before me was to find out how the news was transmitted, and it was one, I confess, which fairly bristled with difficulties. Heinrich, being a neutral, has lately been showing a great interest in the welfare of blinded British soldiers, I remarked to Heck. If he were a friend of Gould's, why should he do this? For some reason of his own, said Heck, possibly to avert suspicion. We know pretty well that he was very deep in it with Gould and had received money from him. Perhaps you will recollect that he admitted it, explaining that it was a loan, and indeed we found his IOU in Gould's desk, made out, no doubt, to lend artistic verisimilitude to a bald and otherwise unconvincing narrative, as your Gilbert has it. You know he said his daughter had been ill, and that in consequence he was short of money. That was too weak. We knew well enough that Heinrich made a good deal out of his fiddle, as his bank balance showed. He was not short of money at all, and I have not the least doubt that the loan was for value received in the shape of information or assistance, perhaps both. Yes, I remember now, I said, reflecting deeply. 3 weeks went by. I was tired and run down, and decided to snatch a fortnight with Doris in Worcestershire before embarking upon a task which was likely to be arduous, if not actually dangerous. Greatly strengthened by my sojourn in delightful Worcestershire, I was back in town, keenly interested in the work I had in hand. One evening I had been down to Hertford and was returning by the Great Eastern Railway to Liverpool Street, when, just before 10 o'clock, the train pulled up abruptly at Stratford. All lights were instantly extinguished, and I was swept into an excited throng of several hundreds of refugees in the subway beneath the line. There, amid a motley gathering, largely composed of panic-stricken foreign Jews, I was compelled to remain for over 3 hours, listening to the venomous barking of the anti-aircraft guns and the occasional rending, ear-splitting crash of a high-explosive bomb. It was the first time I had seen the alien under air raid conditions, though I had heard a good deal about him, and as I watched the cowardly wretches, my whole mind was revolted at the thought that a large proportion of these quivering masses of jelly, for in their fright they were little else, had been welcomed to British citizenship under the imbecile naturalization system. No one blamed them for being frightened. The English women and children of the working classes, huddled in the shelters, were quite obviously frightened, and small wonder. But if they were frightened, they were brave, and they kept their self-control even when the infernal racket overhead was at its worst. I had seldom seen a better proof of the essential superiority of the Briton over the harpies who prey upon him, and as I watched, I felt proud that, cosmopolitan as I am, I had good English blood in my veins. At 10 o'clock next morning I went to Whiteall, where exact of all the damage done by the Gothers was placed freely at my disposal. From the secret reports I made certain extracts for future use. 5 days later. As I sat in my flat in Curzon Street, my man, Burton, brought in copies of the General Anzeiger for Elberfeld Barman, the Berlin Borsen Courier, and the Tageblatt, all of which had been sent me by special messenger from Whitehall. I opened them, and in both the General Anzeiger and the Tageblatt were exultant articles on the success of the air raid upon the metropolitan area a few nights before. They were, of course, luridly written up, but they contained a great deal of perfectly accurate information, as I knew by the secret reports shown to me directly after the raid. How could the enemy know? Of course, the blazing accounts of the terror and panic supposed to have been created in London could have been written up anywhere. But how was it that not only were the localities in which the bombs had fallen accurately specified, but in several instances details were given of the exact damage to certain buildings? By no possibility could the latter information have been the result of an effort of Teutonic imagination. The enemy knew. Proof of it was there in cold print. How did the news reach the Wilhelmstrasse so quickly? It was certainly not by wireless, for every message was picked up and decoded by our own stations. That the news had not passed through the great German wireless stations of Norddeich at the north of the Elbe or Nauen, near Berlin, was certain. Here was a pretty problem set for solution. As I sat alone in my room that evening, having dined at my club and returned to the enjoyment of slippers, a novel, and a good cigar, I reflected on the task I had in hand. I realized, of course, that my suspicions of blind Heinrich might be entirely unfounded, but I had at the moment nothing better to go upon, and I decided that, in view of his known association with Gould, whether he was mixed up with the matter we now had in hand or not, a close watch upon him might provide some facts of interest. Upon my arrival in London from Paris, I had sought out blind Heinrich, who was now living in a boarding house in Hereford Road, Bayswater, close to Westbourne Grove. In the same house was now living a dainty little woman, a Belgian refugee, who was in very straitened circumstances. According to her own story, she had become separated from her husband, a rich merchant of Brussels, before going on board a boat at Ostend during the terrible flight from Belgium in 1914. Since then she had been unable to obtain the slightest information about him and did not know even whether he was alive or dead. For nearly 3 years, she related, she had remained in terrible anxiety, which was rapidly wrecking her nerves and her life. As a refugee, a pitiful victim of the catastrophe which had befallen her beloved country, she was existing upon English charity. She called herself Madame Taymans, and her old address in happier days was in the Rue de Namur in Brussels. But her real name was Gabrielle Soyer. Few women in the world could so perfectly adapt themselves to the ever-changing demands of the Secret Service as Madame Soyer. In her present circumstances, she was absolutely at home, for she had been educated in part at a convent near Gembloux and could assume the Belgian accent to perfection. It was an easy matter, therefore, for her to pass for what she pretended to be. In Hereford Road, the Frenchwoman had established herself on my instruction for the purpose of keeping a watchful eye upon the quiet, long-haired, half-blind violinist, who, to all appearances, was eking out only a meagre existence, and whose clothes were of that shabby-genteel brand which usually betrays respectable poverty. But we knew enough of Heinrich's affairs to be convinced that the shabby-genteel role was deliberately assumed for purposes of deception. A splendid musician and a born teacher, Heinrich could command his own terms, and, as a matter of fact, he made a good deal of money. More than this, he was well known in high circles of society, where his teaching abilities gave him the entree to a large number of the best houses. And of course, no one ever suspected that the half-blind old fiddler, crawling from house to house in the aristocratic quarters in which he found most of his pupils, was in reality the alert and dangerous agent of the enemy, which subsequent events revealed him to be.